Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told This podcast, where we like to take deep dives into all sorts of things you might not even realize are interesting.
Yeah, it's amazing how everyday things can have such a cool backstory once you dig a little deeper.
So today we're tackling something that probably everyone listening has used at least once in their life.
It's definitely one of those inventions that we kind of take for granted.
But trust me, the story of the sewing machine is anything but boring.
It's got it all: intrigue, competition, drama.
Even a little bit of danger if you can believe it.
Oh yeah, I can definitely believe it.
So to kick things off, let's rewind way back before Singer was a household name and all that.
Back to the very, very beginning.
When did humans first start thinking, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could get a machine to do all this tedious stitching for us?
Right, because sewing by hand is no joke.
Tell me about it.
It's been around for centuries, and it's always been so time-consuming.
I imagine people was dreaming of a faster, easier way to sew pretty much as soon as they started poking needles through fabric.
Oh, absolutely, and one of the earliest attempts we have on record is this guy Thomas Saint back in 1790.
1790, wow.
He designed a machine for sewing leather and canvas.
Leather in Kansas. Think about trying to sew a ship's sail by hand.
Ugh, no thanks.
I can barely handle sewing a button. But seriously, Saint's machine, even if it never actually got built, shows us how early inventors were already thinking big.
They saw the potential for a machine that could handle those really tough materials.
Right, but like you said, it never actually got past the design phase. What were the main roadblocks back then?
Well, for one thing, the technology just wasn't there yet.
Like they had the vision, but not the tools to make it a reality?
Exactly. The precision needed to create a machine that could push a needle through thick fabric, make consistent stitches, and do it over and over again. It was a massive engineering challenge.
Plus, the materials available back then weren't exactly ideal for building complex machines.
It's like trying to build a race car out of wood.
Right, so Saint's idea was ahead of its time, but someone else picked up the torch eventually, right?
That's right. We have to fast forward a few decades to meet Barthélemy Timonier, a French tailor who got a patent for his sewing machine in 1830.
Okay, so he actually built a working machine.
He did, and he even set up a factory to produce uniforms for the French army.
Wow, so this is getting serious.
It was, but then things took a bit of a turn.
Wait, you're telling me the sewing machine story has drama?
Oh yeah, this part is wild. A group of tailors, fearing that Timonier's invention would put them out of work, stormed his factory and burned it to the ground.
Whoa, hold on. They burned down his factory because of a sewing machine.
It's true, they were scared of losing their livelihoods.
I guess people have been worried about machines taking their jobs since the very beginning?
Absolutely, and this incident really foreshadowed a lot of the social and economic anxiety that would come with the rise of machines in general.
It's kind of mind-blowing that something as seemingly simple as a sewing machine could cause such chaos.
It just shows you how technology, even something that seems pretty basic, can have huge ripple effects.
So we've got early prototypes, factory fires, drama. What's next in this sewing machine saga?
Well, the race to perfect a sewing machine was really heating up at this point, and the stakes were getting higher.
And this is where we get to Elias Howe, right?
Exactly. Howe is credited with one of the biggest breakthroughs in sewing machine history, the needle with the eye at the point.
Okay, I'm picturing a needle, but I have to admit I don't really think about where the eye is.
Most people don't, but it's a big deal. Before Howe, sewing machines used needles that were pretty similar to the ones for hand sewing with the eye at the blunt end.
Huh. So how did moving the eye to the point make a difference?
It was revolutionary. It allowed for the creation of the lock stitch, which is way stronger and more durable than the chain stitch they were using before.
Lock stitch, chain stitch. Okay, I'm going to need a sewing lesson here.
Haha, no problem. So imagine you have two threads working together to create a stitch. One thread comes from the needle going down through the fabric, and the other comes from a bobbin underneath.
Okay, I'm following so far.
The needle thread goes through a loop of that bobbin thread, which basically locks the stitch in place.
Ah, so that's what it's called, a lock stitch.
Right, and that makes it a lot more secure than the chain stitch, where one little broken thread could unravel the whole seam.
That sounds like a tailor's worst nightmare.
It definitely wasn't ideal. Howe's lock stitch really was a game changer, and it's what most modern sewing machines still use today.
But wasn't there another inventor, Wolfer Hunt, who also came up with the sewing machine around the same time?
That's right. Hunt actually created a machine that used a similar needle design to Howe's, but he never patented it.
Why not?
Some say he was worried about the impact it would have on seamstresses. He thought they'd lose their jobs.
So even back then, people were thinking about the ethical side of new technology.
It's always been a part of the conversation, but speaking of competition, there's one more big name we need to bring in: Isaac Singer.
Ah, Singer, the name that's practically synonymous with sewing machines.
Right. Singer was a brilliant businessman. He saw the potential of Howe's lock stitch technology and built his own machine.
So was he just a copycat?
Not exactly. He made some key improvements to the design and made his machines more efficient and more affordable.
So he was kind of like the Steve Jobs of the sewing machine world.
Haha, yeah, I guess you could say that, but more importantly, he totally revolutionized how sewing machines were sold.
Like he figured out how to get them into people's homes?
Exactly. He introduced things like installment plans so people could buy a machine even if they couldn't afford the full price up front.
Smart move.
He also created a network of dealerships and repair shops so people could get their machines fixed if something went wrong.
It sounds like he was thinking about the whole customer experience, not just the machine itself.
And that was a big part of his success. Singer's business savvy, along with his improvements to the design, made him the dominant force in the sewing machine industry.
But I have a feeling this story isn't over yet, right?
You're right, there's a whole lot more to come. We've got patent battles, a sewing machine war, and the rise of a sewing machine empire.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's take a quick break and then we'll dive into all that.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back with more on the fascinating world of the sewing machine on Tell Me More. And we're back with Tell Me More, still exploring the wild world of the sewing machine.
I know we've covered a lot of ground already. Early inventors, patent battles, factory fires.
But now I want to get to the part where the sewing machine really starts to change the world.
Right, because all that early stuff was really just setting the stage.
So let's talk about how this invention transformed everyday life for people.
It's pretty remarkable when you think about it. This one machine had such a huge ripple effect on everything.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What was life like before the sewing machine showed up?
Well, just imagine every single piece of clothing, every curtain, every blanket, everything was made by hand.
Oh, that sounds exhausting.
It was incredibly labor-intensive, especially for women who were often the ones doing all the sewing at home.
Yeah, I can barely handle sewing a button on. I can't imagine making an entire dress by hand.
And it wasn't just clothes either. Think about all the linens and household items that needed to be sewn.
It must have taken forever.
It did. Sewing was a constant chore, a never-ending task.
So when the sewing machine comes along, it's like a huge weight lifted off people's shoulders.
Absolutely. Suddenly, tasks that used to take hours could be done in minutes.
Talk about a time saver.
It freed up so much time and energy for people, especially women.
And I've heard that this newfound free time actually contributed to the women's suffrage movement.
That's right. Some historians believe that the sewing machine played a role in giving women more time to pursue education and social activism.
Wow, so not just a labor-saving device, but a catalyst for social change.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it. But it's important to remember that not everyone benefited equally from this invention.
Oh, right, because while it was great for a lot of people, it probably wasn't so great for the people who made their living as seamstresses.
Exactly. For working-class women who relied on sewing for income, the sewing machine was a mixed blessing.
On one hand, it made their jobs easier, but on the other hand, it meant that fewer seamstresses were needed.
And that led to job displacement and lower wages for many.
So it's kind of a classic case of technology disrupting an industry.
And it's a pattern we see repeated throughout history. New technology creates progress and innovation, but it can also create winners and losers.
And often the people who are already struggling are the ones who get hit the hardest.
That's unfortunately true. But it's also important to acknowledge the positive impact the sewing machine had for a lot of women, especially middle-class women.
Right. It gave them more time for things other than just sewing.
They could pursue education, get involved in their communities, even just have more leisure time.
So it wasn't a universal solution, but it definitely opened up new possibilities for many.
And speaking of new possibilities, let's talk about how the sewing machine itself evolved over time.
Yeah, we started with those hand-cramped models, then came the foot treadle machines.
But the real game changer was the introduction of electricity.
Right, like with pretty much everything else, electricity totally revolutionized the sewing machine.
It made it even more convenient and efficient. Suddenly, you didn't need to crank a handle or pump a pedal.
Just plug it in and go.
Exactly. And from there, the technology just kept advancing.
Today, we have computerized machines with all sorts of bells and whistles. It's incredible how far we've come.
It really is. But you know what's interesting? Even with all these advancements, there are some fundamental things about the sewing machine that haven't really changed.
Like what?
Well, think about the different types of stitches we have. Chain stitch, lock stitch, overlock cover stitch. These basic stitches have been around for a long time.
Okay, I'll admit I get a little lost when it comes to the different stitch types. I know there's a difference, but I couldn't tell you what it is.
Haha. It's understandable there's a lot to keep track of, but it's actually pretty fascinating once you understand the mechanics behind each one.
Okay, so give me a crash course in sewing stitches.
All right, so we talked about chain stick earlier. It's the one that uses a single thread to create a series of loops.
And the downside is that if the thread breaks, the whole seam can unravel.
Right, it's not the most durable stitch. It's still used today for certain applications, but for things that need to withstand a lot of wear and tear, it's not ideal.
Makes sense. So then we have the lock stitch, which was Eliath Howe's big contribution.
Exactly. The lock stitch uses two threads, one from the needle and one from a bobbin, to create a more secure stitch.
So if one thread breaks, The seam is still held together by the other one.
That's right, it's like a double knot. It's the most common stitch used in home sewing machines today because it's so reliable.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about those other stitches you mentioned, overlock and cover stitch?
Overlock is also known as serging. It creates a finished edge on fabric to prevent fraying.
Oh, so that's what gives those seams that nice clean look.
Exactly. You'll often see it on knit fabrics like t-shirts and sweatshirts.
Cool. And what about cover stitch?
Cover stitch is typically used for hems and decorative top stitching. It creates two parallel rows of stitches on the top of the fabric and a zigzag pattern on the underside.
So it's like a more decorative stitch.
You could say that it gives things a more polished look,
Wow, I had no idea there was so much to know about stitches.
and we've only just scratched the surface.
Haha. Well, maybe we'll have to do a whole deep dive on sewing stitches sometime.
I'd be up for that. But for now, let's move on to another important part of the sewing machine, the feed mechanism.
The feed mechanism.
That's how the fabric moves through the machine.
Oh, right. I never really thought about how that works.
Most home machines use a drop feed system.
Drop feed. What does that mean?
It means there are these little teeth called feed dogs that pop up from below the needle plate.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Those feed dogs drip the fabric and pull it forward as you sew.
So it's not the needle pulling the fabric, it's those little teeth.
Exactly. It's a pretty ingenious system.
It really is. It's amazing how all these different parts work together to create something that seems so simple on the surface.
It's a testament to human ingenuity, for sure.
So we've talked about the impact of the sewing machine on homes and on women's lives, but what about its influence on fashion and the garment industry as a whole?
That's a huge part of the story. The sewing machine changed the way we make clothes, the way we consume fashion, and the way the industry itself operates.
Okay, so let's dive into that world next.
All right, let's explore how the sewing machine shaped the fashion industry as we know it.
And we're back with Tell Me More, ready to explore how the sewing machine shaped the world of fashion.
You know, we talked about how it revolutionized homes and freed up time for women.
But the impact on fashion is huge.
It really is. The sewing machine completely changed how we make clothes and how we think about fashion as a whole.
So before the sewing machine, what did the fashion scene look like?
Well, before, the sewing machine clothing was mainly a local thing.
Local how so?
The garments were mostly made by hand, either at home or by small dressmaking businesses.
So if you wanted a new dress, you had to find someone to make it for you.
Right, and that took time, and it was expensive.
So fashion was basically for the elite.
Pretty much. But then the sewing machine comes along, and suddenly clothes can be produced much faster and cheaper.
And that means more people can afford to buy new clothes.
Exactly, and that's when we start to see the rise of mass production for clothing.
So instead of one tailor making one shirt, you have factories churning out hundreds or even thousands.
Right, and that completely changes the game.
I bet that had a huge impact on fashion trends.
Oh, absolutely. Trends could spread much faster, and people could afford to keep up with the latest styles.
So it's kind of like the birth of fast fashion as we know it.
It really is. The sewing machine made it possible for fashion to become more accessible and more dynamic.
But faster production doesn't always mean better quality, right?
That's true. One downside of mass production is that quality and craftsmanship can sometimes suffer.
I guess when you're focused on making things quickly and cheaply, something's got to give.
And that's a tension we still see in the fashion industry today.
Right, we have this desire for affordable, stylish clothes, but that often comes at the expense of quality and ethical production.
It's a complicated issue, and the sewing machine is right at the heart of it.
It's kind of like this one invention triggered a whole chain reaction of changes in the fashion world.
And it's not just about the clothes themselves. The sewing machine also had a huge impact on the people making those clothes.
Right, we can't forget about the workers in those early garment factories.
Conditions were often pretty terrible: long hours, low wages, and unsafe working environments.
Kind of a dark side to the story of the sewing machine.
It is, and sadly, those issues haven't entirely gone away, even today.
We still see sweatshops operating in many parts of the world making cheap clothes for us to consume.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line, and that technology can have both positive and negative consequences.
So the story of the sewing machine isn't just about needles and thread. It's about social change, economic forces, and the complex relationship between humans and technology.
Exactly. It's a microcosm of so many bigger trends that have shaped our world.
And the story isn't over yet.
Not by a long shot. Technology keeps evolving, and the fashion industry is constantly adapting.
We have 3D printing, laser cutting, computer-aided design. It's mind-boggling what we can do now.
And it makes you wonder what role the sewing machine will play in the future of fashion.
Will it become obsolete, or will it find new ways to stay relevant?
I think the sewing machine will always have a place in some form or another.
It's such a versatile tool.
And its core function, stitching things together, that's always going to be important.
It's amazing to think that this one invention has had such a long and winding journey.
From humble beginnings to revolutionizing an entire industry, It's a story that just keeps unfolding.
Well said. I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the sewing machine.
It's been a fascinating journey.
I hope you learned something new.
And who knows, maybe you'll look at your own sewing machine a little differently now.
Until next time, keep those minds curious.
And we'll see you back here on Tell Me More.